Hello, welcome to the 18th season of the Productized podcast. My name is Andre Marquet, and I'm hosting today's episode. So we're diving deep into product challenges and emerging opportunities. And today we have a very special guest, someone that has been at Productized a few years ago. Actually, we were just doing the math, and it's now 7 years that we don't see each other in person. And as you may know, this has actually year that marks the 10th anniversary of Productized Conference, and we're thrilled to bring back someone who's been part of that journey for quite some time. Our guest today first spoke at Productized Conference in 2018 here in Lisbon, where he shared insights on wasteless validation techniques and how to leverage both qualitative and quantitative methods for better product decisions. Fast forward to today, and he's one of the leading voices in product strategy, decision-making, and leadership as a writer, a speaker, and advisor who helps teams make better product bets and confidently navigates uncertainty. Please welcome Tim Herbig to the Productized podcast. Tim, welcome. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Andre. Thank you so much for having me. It feels really good to be back, especially after doing the math of it's been 7 years since I stepped on stage in Lisbon.
Yeah, time flies, and especially after, we had a pandemic in between. A lot of this product events actually that were around back then, some of them are not here anymore, but here we are towards the 10th edition. But before we dive into the deep stuff, let's start with a few chill questions. I'm really curious to know what's your favorite app or tech product at the moment?
Favorite app right now is probably the product called Lex, which is basically Google Docs with an AI sidekick. So what I really like about it, it's basically the AI you have on the side. You can choose your own model. So it could be Claude, it could be ChatGPT, it could be Gemini, whatever. Mm-hmm. And you can teach it certain writing prompts about your work. And the best thing is it ties in with your email service provider, in my case, ConvertKit or Kit. Mm-hmm. So it can basically access all the past newsletters. And so whenever I draft a new newsletter, I can just ask it, hey, how can I improve this based on previous newsletters, how they have been doing? And it's an amazing writing coach. So I really love having AI as an enhancement feature, or like a real-time writing coach. That's what it is.
So what's the name of it?
Lex, L-E-X.
LXX. Yes, I've heard about it. I've used it myself. Yeah, it's a great tool. I mean, I was using it in the very early stages. They might have improved the tool a little bit now.
Yeah, I tried it, I think, a few years back, and then it didn't really stick with me. But then when they announced this integration with the email providers, that's when it clicked for me. And then the quality just skyrocketed.
Yeah, that's so true. I see a lot of the value that you get from this tools is really the enhancement, but that enhancement has the pluggability of the tool towards other information silos that you already have in your life, right?
Right.
Because you've written so many blog articles and newsletters and so on that, if the tool has no context, then it's going to be a vanilla tool, and you don't want vanilla, right? You want chocolate, you want flavor, and that's really where it stands out. So good to know.
Great. Yeah.
So what's the most unusual or interesting thing about you that people cannot find online?
How obsessed I am with filter coffee. And by that, I mean the quality, not the quantity. Probably what tells you the most about it is that I keep an Airtable database where I document every coffee that I brew, essentially, because I segment what's the bean, the roaster, which brewing method, water temperature, grind size, brew time, all the good stuff. And then I rate it.
Wow, so that's hardcore. Do you roast your own coffee?
I don't. I think that's really next level. But the problem is with that, you need actual physical space to roast. I tried it once with a friend of mine on his barbecue. Yeah. The results were, let's say, suboptimal, but we enjoyed the process. It's something I want to get into at one point to get create the Tim Herbig roast. But until then, I have to.
You know what? you ever do that, I will hire you to do the
Yeah.
coffee for
Product coffee.
productized.
I mean,
Yeah,
I feel
product
like there's a
coffee,
big overlap. Yeah,
product coffee. Here we go. Well, I think there's someone with the product coffee brand. Maybe it's like a Toke
probably.
or yeah, it's kind of an obvious one. But filtered coffee. Here we go.
Yeah.
How hard is it to actually roast the beans? Is it just the spacing, or is it like temperature needs to be right and you have like this very expensive gizmos to check temperature? What's the art?
So the way I understand it, like product management, like coffee
Mm-hmm.
making is like garbage in, garbage out. So I think the
Mm,
first thing is you have to get high quality
right.
raw coffee beans. So you need a great producer and import them. Need to make sure where they're coming from, how are they have been, what's the variety of them. I think then the only thing you really have to pay attention to is to not overdo it with the heat and to understand which kind of roasting creates which kind of flavor profiles. Like, do you want dark roast, lighter roasts? There's this infamous sound a coffee bean makes when it's roasted, which is a crack. And so you have to roast into the first crack. And
Mm-hmm.
then up until then, it's very delicate. If you hit the second crack, you probably overdone it. So I
Right.
think these are the rules of thumb. But everything in between, you just have to experiment and figure out which taste works for you, what kind of taste do you need and want. So I think you can get pretty compact roasts like that and just roast in small batches, which is amazing. But I think the bigger challenge is getting really good raw coffee beans from a producer you actually like.
And that means importing from where?
Importing,
South America, I guess.
there's some shops where you can just buy raw coffee beans from certain producers and they get you these. And probably for starting out, it's great. I think if you want to really develop your own flavor profile, you probably need to have a personal relationship with the actual producer and how to get that into the country. So it's a big operation.
And coffee is such an important and underestimated part of our lives. I mean, I was checking out this video the other day on YouTube, of course, how the lack of good quality coffee led people in Eastern Germany to revolt against the established power, because you cannot, and in Russia as well, in Soviet Russia, because they could not afford to buy coffee beans
Mhm.
from the international market, because,
Yeah,
buy coffee beans, you have to import them. And to import, you have to buy in US dollars. And if you don't have
exactly.
US dollars to
Yeah,
buy, then, and nobody is taking your currency, whatever
yeah,
it is, then you are in a situation where you don't have coffee. So you have to resort to all kinds of, um,
yeah.
kinds of garbage, including other cereals that are not really coffee.
Yeah.
And that makes people really upset. I guess,
Understandably so.
understandably so.
I mean, I was born in Eastern Germany, but I was way too young to drink coffee at that age. So I don't have first-hand experience on that, but it checks out.
Yeah, when I was a kid here in Portugal, we were not importing that much coffee neither, because we were out of the EU, right? And for the same
Right.
reasons, I guess, we didn't want to spend hard currency in importing good quality coffee. So people in the morning, they were not drinking real coffee. They were drinking chicory, which is, I guess
Mm.
some kind of, cereal,
Yeah, yeah.
roasted cereal. But that was very popular. That was very popular back in the 80s. Eventually coffee, spiked up. When I was a kid, that was as close to coffee as the middle income family could
Right.
afford during the week, right? I mean, you would go for a coffee shop maybe in
Yeah.
the weekend or so. Or, if you were an adult, maybe you could afford it. So if you're never stumbled upon product management, what do you imagine you would be doing today?
Probably have to guess that I would probably have ended up in the auto industry because my grandfather had
Mm,
its own logistics company and my dad used to work in the auto industry. And so naturally I feel I would have gravitated towards that industry. Probably
auto,
not from auto
automobile.
cars,
Yeah. Which
probably
is
not from mechanical perspective, but more like
right.
from a business sensey marketing kind of angle, I would
Which is
assume.
also being eaten by software nowadays.
It is. I think it's similar to treating a product. I think they should think back to what's the core, what's the thing only they can do. What's the differentiator that is left? And honestly, I think it's like so many cases, the answer is brand. Like focus on protecting the brand, what the brand stands for. I think some car makers are better at that than others in Germany from the naive outside perspective.
Hmm.
because everything else can be replicated so easily. But building brand and trust in that brand, that takes decades, and leveraging that for whatever is next for the car industry, I guess, is the big challenge.
Yeah, I guess brand, it is important, but I don't know, just allow me to challenge that a little bit. I mean, the sense that especially for electric cars, now you have seen the rise of this Chinese brands, and even
Yeah,
arguably to a point, Tesla was not even a
yeah,
brand 10 years ago, right? Or 15 years ago.
right.
Definitely not a brand for your average person.
Yeah,
BYD was not a brand 5 years ago. Nobody would know what BYD
it's
is,
true.
right? I mean, they were out there in China but not in Europe to any significant
Yeah,
extent. And now, BYD is essentially eating the electrical car market. Tesla
yeah,
has already taken a fair share of it as well. And most of the brands that were the brands that, our generation grew up with, BMW and so on and so forth, are really having, uphill fight to take
yeah.
a fair share of the e-car market. So what do you think that is happening?
Again, I think they might have spread themselves too thin. I think, again, for me, what it comes back down to is, let's take Mercedes. It's one of the prime German car making
Right.
brands, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
it has this premium vibe. It's never going for the
Mm-hmm.
mass market.
Yeah.
I think you would have to rethink like what makes stepping into a Mercedes. And I think they were a little bit too quick in trying to broaden the electric vehicle platforms and playing catch up and getting a little bit, being more focused on the outside than the inside of like, where do we want to go? A bit more like what Apple is doing, right? They're never being the first adopter, first movers, always like seeing how the market plays out. And then they bring their unique DNA
Mm-hmm.
to the new category.
Right.
And I can't be the judge of who managed to do that, but I think Mercedes from the outside, it felt like for a time they were a little bit too reactive and too much like we need to have a broad electric vehicle portfolio versus, okay, maybe we can take a hit on the quote unquote lower cost market share, comparatively speaking, and don't have an e-vehicle there. We don't compete there. We stay focused on the premium segment because these customers, they don't want to, they don't need an affordable electric car that quickly, right? We can sell them a very high-end luxury electronic car and maybe even keep the combustion engine cars around for longer. And I think for other companies, they, like Volkswagen, for example, they had a massive project investing in software. Like they want to have a massive software company, or see other companies who try to be better at software than pure software players, right? Like always cringe when a company says they make a better car interface than Apple CarPlay.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, just let me use CarPlay.
Yeah, although actually Tesla went that route, right? They have built their own
They did.
car
And again, I think
interface.
it's the question of your target audience. Like for me, that's like a no-go criteria to buy a Tesla. It's like, I don't want that. I want CarPlay. I think again, Tesla went to the length of what focus from the wedge they entered the market for the fanboys, the nerds, right? Who love the big tablet that was mounted in the middle of it, right? Aesthetically, you can debate it. But essentially, you have this big gaming console in there, which then they leverage all of that. And they integrated, this is probably the biggest power move Tesla ever made, like building a vertically integrated charging infrastructure with the cars, right? Which is what all of the other car makers missed, essentially. And now I would argue, at least in the US, the charging station, and I think they even got an agreement that the US adopts their charging standard for the majority.
I didn't
That's
know
even
that.
maybe the bigger infrastructural play for Tesla than quote unquote just the cars.
So just as a segue to our next part, you've been working in product for quite some time now, and I'd love to get back to those beginning days. But how did you first get into product management in the first place?
Yeah. So that was 2010. I was working at a performance marketing agency, as a working student, and then they had an internal tech product, advertising monitoring product. And then the CTO said, we're now going to do Scrum to build this product, and you're going to be the PO. I was like, cool. What does that mean?
Exactly. What is it?
Here's a Word template for user stories. Fill that out and tell the developers what to do. Naturally speaking, you can guess how well it went. Not that well, right? Developers were not ready. Senior developers were not ready to be told what to do from a junior working student. And by then, after I left that company, I was like, this whole Scrum Agile shit, all the buzzwords, it's Scrum Masters and story points. That just feels like an excuse to do real work, like busy work. That's what it felt to me back then from the implementation I met. But yeah, that's how I stumbled into product. And I felt that spark of quote unquote owning a product, but like giving a product shaping a product and giving its direction. Like that's what I felt. I just felt that setup combined with the how Scrum was used back then, that just wasn't a fruitful environment.
And looking back to your 2018 Productized conference talk, you focused on voiceless validation techniques. Has your thinking evolved since then, or looking back at that talk, you're still very much in line to what you were saying back then?
And quick break, did you know this year's Productized conference is a big one? We're celebrating our 10th edition. For a decade, we've been bringing product managers, designers, and innovators together in Lisbon for top-tier insights, interactive workshops, and invaluable networking. This year, it's bigger and better than ever with world-class speakers and special anniversary celebrations. Don't miss your chance to be part of it, October 16th to 17th in Lisbon.
Join us for the big celebration. Tickets are now available at www.productized.co. We hope to meet you there.
I like to think it has evolved, and yet I think the truth of the core of the talk is still a pretty universal truth I stick to today, which is essentially the method you want to deploy, let's say during discovery, has to match the intent or the question you're trying to answer. A big core thesis of the talk was, look, for example, you can't test willingness to pay or desirability by asking 3 people if they would buy it. And that is on a technical level still true. On a more meta level, the teams and the companies that get to work with these days, I try to remind them through this fundamental thing of like, clarify your intent, whether that's your research question or your assumption, before you pick the method. And don't just say, oh, we're doing discovery, we're always going to do a user interview. So that's certainly still a stable piece in my arguments and conversations these days.
So we all know the struggle. One day your team is aligned, and the next, a new priority comes in, and suddenly your roadmap is a little bit chaotic, to say so. So you've helped many teams tackle this. I think that's your professional practice. As you run a consulting side of the business, right? What's your biggest mistake, or better yet, what's the biggest mistake that you see teams making when it comes to this kind of decision making?
I think the biggest mistake is that whenever a team tries to deploy or work with a decision-making artifact, whether that's a one-pager, a roadmap, OKRs, whatever you use for that, during its creation, they don't imagine how it will actually help them down the road. So what I, for example, do when I do work with teams on OKRs, which could fill this role, right? Like priorities change. You can say like, do I update the OKRs or do I reject this feature request because it doesn't match the OKRs? Like, but running OKRs, I like to do this test with teams of like, look, 2 weeks from now, can you actually check in on these metrics? Like, can you actually use that as a progress measurement? And the same is true with, let's say, a one-pager, whatever format you use. Like, I ask teams, will this help you make a decision 4 weeks from now, right? Like, I think that's the thing that's oftentimes misunderstood. It's in theory, a lot of these frameworks work really well, but in a specific situation for a company, will it actually help them? And I think that's something teams have to take to heart and then adopt or adapt the way they use these prioritization methods, right? Whether it's great to say a now, next, later roadmap is a great vehicle. But again, the question is, okay, you show this to a salesperson as a stakeholder, will this format help them understand your priorities? If it does, great. If not, what else is needed so that it does that?
And you often talk about structured decision-making frameworks. Can you share one that teams can apply immediately, even someone listening to this?
So my favorite one is the one I came across it in 2014. It's called impact mapping. It's been around much longer. I think the biggest credit goes to Gojko Acic for writing literally the book on impact mapping in 2010. So it's a decision tree structure that has been around for a long time. For me, it's the most applicable structure for that, because I think it's really good in helping teams connect the day-to-day doing, the nitty-gritty, to overarching strategic goals. And I think that is so important. And it beautifully links to things like OKRs, to discovery practices and strategy. Again, like we talked about coffee, it's garbage in, garbage out. So if you don't do the work, it will only display meaningless vanity metrics and insights. But if you do the real work, it's a great vehicle for connecting the dots and identifying your path forward.
So that's a book by Goiko Adzik.
Yeah.
All right. And have you been actually using this as a practice? How does it unfold when you go to a team? You ask them to fill in the impact mapping canvas, or how does it work?
So the funny thing is, I rarely do that with teams because frankly, like no one needs more frameworks. No one needs more frameworks. So what I do instead is when I have a conversation with the team, I try to understand where are they at right now? Are they deep in a solution space and struggling which solution to work on? Or do they have a big strategy goal? They don't know how to go from there. So depending on where they are, most often teams are more in the solution space. So what I'd rather do is I have them list the different features or outputs they currently work on next to each other. We do that on a Miro board or whatever. So we list these and then I ask them, okay, what is the outcome, the user outcome this output is trying to create? Like what's the change in behavior you're trying to create through this feature? And we do that for every feature. Chances are for some of these features, they can't name that outcome, right? And so that's one of the first gaps, because that basically means you don't know how to measure success. You don't know how valid the output is. You have lots of uncertainties. So that's like, okay, you should probably learn that. Like, what do you want to achieve with this output? And from there, you can map it even further. You can say, okay, this outcome's great, but for which customer segment is this really relevant? Like, which segment do you want to focus on? And why then, going further, why do you want to focus on this segment? So you go to the highest level, the impact, which might lead to an actual strategy goal, which is increase average revenue per user in the US. And suddenly you can map that then back down and think about which segments, which outcomes, which outputs. And at the lowest level, which is one that I like to add, is also talk about which experiments, like which uncertainty is worth, do I still have to reduce around the output? So I don't say, let's do impact mapping. I rather talk with them quite naturally. And then I place the things they're saying on an invisible impact map.
Right.
And then I connect the dots. And in the end, it's like, surprise, that's an impact map.
That's your magic.
Exactly. And I think that's so important that people don't think, let's do the framework, but like, let's have a conversation and we use the framework to make sense of it.
So, product leaders often struggle this. And I was having this conversation with Julia the other day about balanced data-driven decisions and gut feelings. What's your personal approach to this? And, you were speaking about experimentation, and I think experimentation is a good example to that, right? I mean, there's a number of experiments you can run. There's only that much time and resources that you can afford to spend on experimentation. So how do you tackle this?
I tackle this I go back, one of my favorite quotes around that these days is from Ravi Mehta, who used to be a CPO at Tinder and prior to Facebook. And he has this great quote where he says, paraphrasing here, essentially discovery is about getting to informed conviction. So I always tell people, okay, informed conviction is what we're looking for. That's the state you want to go to. And what I like about it is it's not a score, right? You don't score informed conviction. It's this mystical thing where a team says, based on what we know, we're confident in either dismissing this idea or following up on that. So I love this. This is the fundamental state. And then the question does not become which method do we want to use next, but what's the next thing you can do to get closer to informed conviction, say in the next 1 or 2 weeks? So I think that's an important state to keep in mind. The goal is not to complete the method. The goal is to have informed conviction. I think the other mental model that I like to say, I think it's important to understand that I think the bigger the assumption, less you can test it in a granular way. Like you can't A/B test the expansion to Asia, because it requires more than a split test of a feature, right? It requires a sales and marketing org, whatever. So I think that's important. And instead, when you make such a big decision like expanding to Asia, I think it's more about dissecting it. Like, what are the components of that, the strategy components? Which of these components are we more certain of? Which of these are we less certain of? Okay, for the less certain ones, do we just want to take the risk or do we want to do something to mitigate it further? So to summarize, I think it's what do you need to get to informed conviction, which is great because it makes it contextual. It's not universal. It's contextual for each team. What do you need to get to informed conviction? What's the next thing you can do to get to informed conviction or closer to it? And if you have really large decisions, to slice that into its individual components and then think about how do I test individual things rather than trying to test big strategic directions.
Okay, and that led us to making tough calls, and stakeholder alignment is often a challenge. I would say, there's probably certain classes of products and industries where this is even truer than in others. But what kind of strategies do you recommend to navigate stakeholder alignment? We have this very interesting framework by Arne, very strange term name.
Auftragsklärung.
Exactly. Thanks for pronouncing it so well. So do you have any personal take on this as well?
Yeah, I mean, funnily enough, like when the Auftragsklärung was created, I also used to work at Zing. So I think it was a first-hand experience of how powerful it can be and what's the framing. In the beginning, to me, it felt like I have to fill out a template. I still have to fill out a form to do my work. It took me a while to realize the actual value of it. I think it doesn't matter which template you use. I think the template can be contextual to what works in your company. The thing that I will say, which I think unifies things like the Auftragsklärung or other frameworks, is that you have an explicit conversation. And I think that's the beauty in that. It's like everybody keeps talking about, be more user-centric or, become a platform, whatever that means. But if you really look at it, like, what does that mean? Like, what do we want to achieve? What is not allowed not to happen? What are the boundaries? I think that's an oftentimes underestimated thing, like to discuss boundaries and off-limit metrics, for example. That's a big contributor to actual clarity. So it sounds very generic, but I think to me, it always comes down to, can you make the core ideas of what are you trying to do explicit, whether that's metrics, frameworks, or written one-pagers? Because that sort of objectified starting point should be your go-to place whenever you encounter a place of conflict with the stakeholder. But you should be able to go back to this thing of like, but look, 2 months ago we agreed on that. Happy to change it, but I want us to do it deliberately and consciously and not just dismiss it just by not looking at it anymore.
So let's change direction a little bit and talk about something every product leader has struggled with, roadmaps, strategy in certain times. How do you see your whole road mapping planning when the future is so unpredictable? Are there any strategies for keeping up the team's alignment, focus when priorities constantly shift? And I understand you were using that specific process when you were at Zing, but, has that evolved? Because from what I know, that has been around for 8 or 9 years as well. And what's the current state of the art in terms of strategic alignment vis-a-vis roadmap planning?
I think the starting point that I always take is, which is true for all the work that I do with companies, I always start with like what do they need in their context. Like, for example, when you talk about like alignment and time horizons, I think it's important to acknowledge the practical reality of the company, right? It's great to come in and say, don't plan further than 6 weeks because that's the agility mindset. When they're like, look, we have a rolling 18-month financial planning process. That's not how it works, right? You can debate if it's good or bad, but that's the reality, right? I think so. That's the first thing to understand. Factors influence planning horizons because some things you might not be able to change, right? If I'm a publicly listed company, I can't change accounting standards for how financial planning is done. So I think these boundaries, so to speak, I try to understand them. And within these boundaries, I think it's more about between, for example, top management and the teams, the company leadership and the teams, to understand who has which sphere of influence, which is I think it's an underestimated and very old concept by William H. Shatner. Is really understand, look, the company should be focused on the big strategic metrics and directions and should reflect market conditions or stakeholder interests, whatever, shareholder interests in metrics or priorities. But they need to understand where their sphere of influence stops and where the sphere of influence of the teams start. And I think by really like literally writing it out, okay, what does the company influence? What does the team influence? And where's the border or the overlap? I think that's the crucial part, because that typically the teams can be much more nimble and agile in their shifting their priorities. And by trying to not giving too much strict direction from the top through the sphere of influence of the teams can still reinterpret the company direction in a much more flexible way. So to me, I would say it's about each level has to understand its sphere of influence and the zone of genius where they should play, where they should make calls, interactions, and clarities. And just, align the different languages, so to speak. Like company priorities speak a different language than team priorities.
And what role do you see for experimentation in such
I think the beauty is that oftentimes teams, because they can be more nimble, they can take big assumptions the company's making about a new direction and translate certain aspects of it into their scope. Let's, for example, if you say, again, I go back to this example, let's say we're a SaaS company who says we're going to expand to Asia and we're going to go after accountants, maybe we have financial software. And then maybe the one product team that the growth team, maybe, for example, maybe they can run an experiment on the homepage, on the conversion rate of the registration or the login or whatever. And so they can test that and saying, look, the value proposition we use in Europe doesn't really work that well in Asia for attracting customers. So they can test one aspect of the bigger strategy. They can't, you wouldn't just say, just because of that, you don't go to Asia. But you can say, okay, that part of our strategy needs to be refined. So again, I think it comes back to this fundamental bit is where's the biggest uncertainty in this strategic move we're making, and how can we reduce the uncertainty, aka get closer to informed conviction in that, and which tactics then help us there? Is it something as simple as A/B test, or is it something larger, like a larger scale experiment?
Yeah, and you've been exploring the role of also AI in product management. What have you seen in practice, and your practice or people that you consult with, that is actually shaping the role of the product manager? Where do you see that this is leveraging? And this goes backtrack a little bit to the first tool that we were talking about, but now related to the product manager's role.
I think I personally still see AI functionalities as, like we said in the beginning, as big enhancers of existing work, existing tasks, right? I think it helps to answer questions more quickly, complex questions. I think the most obvious one is always like synthesizing user insights. Say you did a bunch of interviews, survey data. Computers are just much better at making sense of these large data sets than humans are brain-wise. One thing that is really underestimated, which I'm extremely excited about, because big part of my work is in context of metrics and OKRs to help teams understand what are leading indicators worth focusing on. Now, the problem with leading indicators is that they are sometimes hard to find because it's difficult to get to a point that can be an actual predictor. But through AI, whatever the tool then is, it's just so much easier to understand which metric has a correlation, which leading indicator has a correlation with the lagging metric we're actually going after. And then I can start to focus. I can surface this metric much easier. I think there are tools who have been around to do that a lot, whether it's Mixpanel or Amplitude. They have features already built in, even before the whole AI hype, where they're like, look, if you're looking to drive, let's say, checkout conversions, you should focus on, as an example, search result conversion rates first, because people who are more likely to take one of the search suggestions on the homepage are much more likely to finalize the purchase. And I think that's such a powerful way because it gives you a much clearer target to focus on in your work and still contribute to the big company metrics that the business cares about. So I think it's enhancing, to summarize that, I think it's about enhancing existing data set analysis. I think it's great for getting quantitative starting points. And I think the third one is potentially to be a creative sparings partner, much like the writing tool we talked about. Whether it's about give me creative ideas for what's the objective for these 5 key results, or how to organize a product vision workshop. Like you can use that as a creative sparring partner quite nicely on an individual basis, just for yourself to help you with thinking.
Did you have any go-to tools that you're adamant or really bullish about, or you recommend just because you like them?
I think I would probably always go for the AI for the tool that is integrated in the existing tool that you use. So like if you're using Miro and Miro has AI functionalities, use AI functionality in Miro. I think it's about reducing friction as much as possible. chances are whatever tool you're using in your company already, whether that's Office 365 or Miro or Google Workspace, or more niche, whether you use like something like a road mapping and insights tool like AirFocus or ProdPad or whatever, chances are all of these have some kind of AI functionality built in. And I would always focus on leveraging the functionality in the tool you already have instead of adding another tool. Because these days, general AI capabilities are, from a baseline, relatively easy to commonly integrate it. I think you can take a big step already with that. And other than that, I think things like ChatGPT versus Claude, it's a matter of preference. Like for analytical stuff, I like to work with ChatGPT. As a creative sparrings partner, I like Claude a bit better. But I think that really is a lot of about personal taste.
Mm-hmm. And well, before we start to wrap up, I'd just love to get some broader insights from you. Has you been in this space for well over a decade now, and you've been experiencing so many consulting, opportunities and working with bigger teams and smaller teams, separates an average product manager from a truly great one? And I think you can tell that as you go through your practice, right? And what do you, I don't want you to give me like the three points definition, but just a few points or traits that you really like when you get to work with specific people that you feel that are really well above average.
For me, I would point almost always to self-awareness. I think that to me is the underestimated superpower, because it shows up in so much of your work. It shows up in understanding why you are triggered by the salesperson's request. It shows up in you knowing that you play the political game to get something done, and don't just believe it's the right, it's not the right practice. You can acknowledge it's not the right practice, but it helps you move forward. It helps you understand people dynamics. It also helps you understand your own strengths and where you behave a certain way. I think self-awareness is the thing, because it would show up in so many other disciplines and practices.
And is there any specific or tactical advice you would give to product managers looking to step up their game to develop a better self-awareness?
I think there are a bunch of books out there that can be really, really helpful. I would probably say the biggest one for me in that context is The Courage to be Disliked, which was a game changer for me, because it talks a lot about self-awareness, understanding actual behaviors. So book-wise, that's a great starting point that I always recommend. Beyond that, I personally found most success in having someone who can be like a coach or a sparring partner, or someone who's not sucked into the day-to-day noise of your work, who can give you additional perspective and ask you truly naive question in the best possible way of like, but why did this make you angry? Like, why did you behave that way? I think it's a powerful thing if you can set that up with someone else on a regular basis. I think this could help you tremendously, outside of seeking professional help through personal development coaches, someone helping you understand your own patterns and motives.
All right. So we have a book recommendation, The Courage to be Disliked. And if you could change one thing about how companies approach product management today, what would it be? Maybe some kind of anti-pattern that you keep seeing in your consulting practice.
The anti-pattern that I've seen is that companies adopt a framework blindly just because another company did it. Whether it's the Spotify squad model, the Amazon working backwards, the Google OKRs, I would always, if I would have to change one thing, I would like to see companies treat ways of working like a product, which is to say, which problem should this way of working or framework or method solve for whom? And having that clarity, and only then decide on how they will use it and implement it.
Yeah, I think you kind of had that's very similar to the topic you chose for last year's Product at Heart talk of yours. Not exactly about companies, but more about the product manager themselves, seeing themselves as productizing their own role.
Yeah.
Now that we're speaking about conferences, we've seen the evolution of Productized, or at least far, and I hope you can join us this year as well. Any thoughts on what makes this independent conferences unique?
think you already touched on it. It's like that it is independent. I think these days, we were just chatting about it, these days it is something that helps you make unique. And I think all the still being like founder-led, for lack of a better word, I think it creates a big difference. And just how familiar and welcoming and personal conference feels, I think that's a big differentiator. I will say Lisbon is a big differentiator as well for many people, me included. I think it's just has a different vibe. Like every city has its own DNA, and I think the DNA Lisbon carries, at least to me, is a big contributor. So I would say Lisbon was the geographic part, the nice one, and the other bit is that still like sticking to those founder-led roots and keeping that DNA present and alive.
Well, that's still very much the case for the moment. Well, this has been a really insightful conversation and covered decision-making, roadmaps, product strategy. But before we go, I have two final questions. Do you have any upcoming projects or initiatives you'd like to share?
Yeah, for sure. I'm currently in I like to think it's the last third of writing my book called Real Progress, How to Connect the Dots of Strategy, OKRs, and Discovery. I hope that I can publish it towards the end of the year, after the summer. So that's the biggest project outside of client work that keeps me busy these days.
Okay. And just for people that are maybe not so familiar with book writing, what is your practice? You wake up in the morning and then you have like this full stretch day of writing and searching and researching. How does it unfold in practice?
I think these days I'm more in the editing phase. So it's less about the actual writing. It's more about editing and refining and how do things fit together and thinking about which beta readers do I want, which cover design do I want, like that kind of stuff. So I try to have, I'd say, at least 3-hour blocks for working on the book. That's just what I need to get into it. I know like after 4 or 5 hours, my attention span just goes away for that topic, for that kind of work. So I try to have 3-hour blocks once or twice a week right now. Last year, when I was more on the writing, I had actual writing days, like 1 or 2 days every 2 weeks or so, where I would really just do the writing. So that's the routine right now.
And if people want to follow your work, I mean, obviously they can maybe connect on LinkedIn. That's how I've been following you myself, but you have a web page and you have running a bunch of other things as well. Do you want to share?
Yeah, I think the best way outside of LinkedIn to stay up to date and stay in touch is my newsletter. You can find on my website, herbig.co, where I send a weekly, every Friday goes out, short essay, a few article recommendations, and things that keep me busy.
Are you also using Wax for your book?
I'm using it for the book, for example, to mostly spot inconsistencies. It's like, this is this chapter I'm writing, this is this other chapter. Tell me where the structure is worse, for example,
right,
or where I need more clarity. So again, it's this, I have an editor that I work with, but in between for the actual writing sessions, it's like when I need someone by my side, I use Lex. Yeah.
All right, go Lex. Well, for our listeners, don't forget to follow Productized on LinkedIn and subscribe to the podcast for more great conversations. Also, do follow Tim Herbig on LinkedIn and subscribe to his weekly newsletter to stay updated to his latest insights and resources. This is it for us. Thank you so much for being. And don't forget, Productized Conference is now selling super early birds until the end of the month. So this is your opportunity. And if you cannot take those because for some reason you're listening to the podcast later, do use the promo code podcast, just PODCAST, and you'll get a neat 15% discount on all tickets. So that's it. Thank you so much. Thank you.